At sunrise, Thebes was still a city. Roosters crowed in courtyards. Smoke curled lazily from clay chimneys. Merchants laid out their stalls. On the walls, sentries yawned, leaning on their spears, watching the hills fade into the morning haze. By nightfall, those streets would be running with blood. The houses would be smashed open. The walls would be broken, and Thebes would no longer exist as a city, only as a warning. In a single day, Alexander the Great erased it from the map. Not long before that sunrise, Thebes had been many things. A proud Boeotian city, a former leader of Greece, the home of myths and poets and soldiers who once scared even Sparta. It also carried a wound. Years earlier, at the Battle of Chaeronea, Theban soldiers had stood side by side with Athenians against a rising power from the north. Macedonia, led by King Philip II and his teenage son Alexander, they lost. The Theban sacred band, 300 elite warriors who had once humbled Sparta, were cut down where they stood. Philip buried them with honor, but the message was clear. Macedon now decided Greek affairs. Thebes had tasted glory and humiliation within the same generation. Old men still remembered being feared. Young men grew up hearing how their fathers had been crushed. And then, suddenly, everything changed again. Philip was murdered. The details were messy. A bodyguard, a dagger at a festival, a king lying dead in the dust while the crowd screamed. But one fact rushed through Greece like a shockwave. The man who had tamed the Greek city-states was gone. In his place stood his son, Alexander, in his early 20s. Gifted, yes. Famous already for leading a cavalry charge at Chaeronea. But still, just a youth in the eyes of many. In Athens, in Sparta, in Thebes, men gathered in shaded courtyards and whispered, how strong could this new king really be? How much of his power was his father's shadow, not his own? How often does a great empire die with its founder? Across Greece, an idea began to take shape. Maybe this was the moment. When Alexander learned of his father's death, he did not have time to grieve like an ordinary son. He secured the throne. He neutralized rival claimants. He moved swiftly through the rough northern territories, putting down tribes that smelled weakness. He showed up where they didn't expect him, crushed resistance, and moved on. Every report that reached Greece carried the same pattern: speed, decisiveness, no hesitation. But distance can make danger feel smaller. In Thebes, some exiles who hated Macedonian rule slipped back into the city. Stories spread that Alexander had died in the north, or that his army had been shattered by barbarians. These rumors were false, but they were comforting. Thebes had never accepted Macedonian control in its heart. Now, with Philip dead and a young king distracted, some argued the time had come to break free again, to raise the old banner of Theban independence. They chose to believe the rumor instead of the reports. They chose to gamble. When they finally acted, they acted boldly. They killed a Macedonian garrison commander. They besieged the Macedonian citadel in their own city. They sent secret messages to other Greek states. Revolt now. The moment is here. In their minds, the pattern was clear. Old king dies, young king falls. The old Greek order returns. They had misread the pattern. Far to the north, in Macedon, Alexander got the news. Thebes had revolted. The Macedonian garrison was under attack. Whispers said Athens might follow. Others were watching closely to see if the young king would flinch, delay, negotiate from a distance. He did not. He saw what Thebes had done for what it was. Not just a local rebellion, but a test. If Thebes could rise and survive, others would follow. So he made a decision that would define his rule over Greece. He would not negotiate from afar. He would not move slowly, He would move like a storm. Alexander gathered his forces and marched south. They moved hard and fast, covering incredible distances in days. Men who had marched with Philip felt the difference. There was an urgency here, a sharpened edge. The new king was not content to send envoys and wait. He wanted to appear where his enemies believed he could not possibly be. While Theban envoys tried to convince other cities to join them, while politicians in Athens debated in their assemblies, while Theban leaders reassured themselves that the Macedonian response would be slow, dust rose on the northern roads. Hooves thundered. Boots struck the ground in unison. Alexander was coming. Imagine dawn on the walls of Thebes. Another morning. You lean on your spear, thinking about rumors, about the young king far away, about what your leaders promised, that other Greek allies will march, that Athens will not abandon you, that Macedon cannot respond quickly. You squint into the distance. Something moves on the horizon. At first it looks like a line of dust, then shapes, then standards, then gleaming spear points catching the sun. It's not a scout, it's not a small detachment, it's an army. Before most in the city had even finished breakfast, reality shattered the rumor. Alexander was at the gates. The speed of his arrival hit Thebes harder than any ram. The entire plan, delay, gather allies, face a slow Macedonian advance with Greek unity, collapsed in an instant. Thebes was alone. Other cities hesitated. Some sympathized. But they had just seen what Alexander did in the north. They knew how fast he moved. They knew what failure would cost. So they watched. And Thebes stood alone in its defiance. Alexander encircled the city. He didn't rush blindly into the walls. This was not just about victory. It was about demonstration. Thebes had once been great. Poets had sung of its heroes. Its generals had humbled Sparta. Now it was the city that had dared to knife Macedonian authority the moment Philip's corpse cooled. Alexander needed Greece to understand something simple and terrifying. Challenge me. And this is what happens. Before any attack, there were still chances. Some accounts say Alexander offered terms. Surrender the leaders of the revolt. Hand over those who had killed Macedonian officers. Open the gates and the city might be spared. Inside Thebes, debate ripped through the streets and the council rooms. Some urged compromise. Others shouted for honor. They had already raised the flag of rebellion. Was Thebes to bow again? Had they forgotten the graves at Cheronea? The insult of Macedonian garrisons on their soil? Pride is heavy. Once lifted, it's hard to set down again. Thebes chose to fight. Their envoys refused Alexander's demands. On the walls, shields were hoisted. Bows were strung. Men who had spent their lives farming or trading now stood in armor, staring down at a Macedonian army commanded by a young man with something to prove. Alexander gave the order. The assault would begin. What followed was not a single cinematic charge, but pressure. Constant, grinding pressure. Alexander's troops tested the walls, looking for weaknesses, forcing Theban defenders to race from one point to another. Siege machines creaked into position, arrows arced over stone. Shouts and screams climbed into the sky. The defenders fought hard. They were not cowards. They remembered their city's past, and in that memory they found courage. They pushed back assaults, hurled stones and spears, tried to close every gap. But an army like Alexander's was not just brave. It was disciplined, drilled, used to obeying quickly, adapting, exploiting even the smallest mistake. In siege warfare, a single crack is sometimes all it takes. A gate forced open by a ram weakened the hinges. A tower taken in a brief melee provided a foothold. A unit of defenders, exhausted from rushing along the walls all morning, broke and ran at the wrong moment. The exact sequence is blurred in our sources, but the outcome is clear. At some point in that terrible day, the Macedonians got inside. Once attackers breached the perimeter, city fighting began. Narrow streets, doorways turned into choke points. Defenders tried to rally square by square, intersection by intersection. Men who had confidently talked of freedom days earlier now clutched at swords with shaking hands while their homes burned. Thebes still fought. Women and children ran for refuge in temples, clinging to altars, believing sacred ground would protect them. Some soldiers tried to make a last stand at the citadel, hoping to delay the inevitable, or to at least die together. From the vantage point of the hills, other Greeks watched. Without moving, no army came to relieve Thebes. They saw the Macedonian machine grind forward, methodical and relentless, chewing through the city that had dared to rebel first. Alexander was not a madman hacking wildly. He was calm, focused. He knew this was more than a battle. It was a message being written in fire. By the time the sun dipped low and the light turned red, the fighting was over. Thebes was broken. Macedonian soldiers moved through what had been neighborhoods, dragging prisoners from hiding places, killing men who resisted, hauling others away in chains. Houses that had stood for generations were smashed open. Statues toppled. Temples, once places of quiet prayer, were crowded with weeping, terrified families who discovered that the sacred did not always shield them from the decisions of kings. Alexander had to decide, what now? He could have accepted a negotiated surrender earlier in the day. He could still, even now, choose mercy. He did not. He chose an example. Ancient sources give different numbers and no one counted perfectly in the chaos. But the figures that reach us are brutal. Thousands of Thebans killed. Tens of thousands, men, women, and children, sold into slavery. The city's buildings destroyed, its walls torn down, its land divided among others. Thebes was effectively erased as a political force, its name turned from one of honor into one of caution. News traveled fast. By the time messengers reached other Greek cities, the story was already sharpening itself. Thebes rebelled. Alexander arrived in days, and by nightfall, Thebes was gone. In Athens, in Corinth, in smaller towns scattered across the rocky landscape of Greece, leaders heard the details. They imagined their own walls, their own marketplaces, their own people under those conditions. They looked north and saw not the shaky rule of a new, untested king, but a storm. Any thought of coordinated Greek rebellion evaporated. Some cities sent delegations to Alexander congratulating him, affirming their loyalty, choosing the safe role of polite ally rather than daring rival. Others simply stayed very, very quiet. Alexander had many campaigns ahead of him, against the Persian Empire, across deserts and rivers, into cities with names that still echo today. But before he marched east, he needed his home front secure. That day at Thebes accomplished it. No Greek city would seriously challenge him again until his attention and his life had shifted far away. Thebes paid the price for a question everyone else was asking. What happens if we defy Alexander? Now they knew. Was it necessary? Some argue that Alexander had little choice if he wanted to maintain control. His father had spent years breaking the power of the Greek city-states. A chain of revolts could have undone that quickly. A sharp, unforgettable lesson might have seemed like the most efficient way to prevent a much larger, bloodier conflict. Others see it as cruelty. Could he have punished the leaders and spared the city? Could he have chosen a lighter hand and still kept Greece under his influence? History rarely gives us neat answers. We know the result. We know what the decision did for his reputation. After Thebes, Alexander's name carried a new weight. He was not just the clever student of Aristotle. not just the son of Philip, not just the young general who charged at Cheronea. He was the man who erased a city in a day. His enemies from that point on had to factor that into their calculations. Years later, when he stood on the shores of new seas, when his army muttered about turning back, when he faced stubborn cities with thick walls and proud rulers, the memory of Thebes marched beside him. Not for his men, but for those who watched from afar. This was what defiance could cost. It's easy from a quiet room centuries later to talk about strategy and necessity, about empires and messages and power. It is harder to imagine the sound of boots in your street, the crack of doors being kicked in, the smell of smoke as everything you know vanishes in a single, carefully chosen example. At sunrise, Thebes was still a city. By nightfall, it was a lesson. And in that lesson, written in ruin and ash, Alexander the Great secured his rear, tightened his grip on Greece, and cleared the way for the campaigns that would make him a legend. The echo of that day has not entirely faded. When we speak his name now, Alexander the Great, part of what we mean is this: a man whose ambition could lift cities to glory under his rule, and erase them when they stood in his way.